Science plays a vital role for economic development and societal well-being. Understanding this, the Academy of Sciences Malaysia was established with a mission to be Malaysia's thought leader in all areas of science, technology, and innovation. To realize its mission, ASM harnesses the nation's top scientific minds to chart the STI direction and facilitates the implementation of an innovation-led economy for the country. ASM's commitment lies firmly in fostering a culture of excellence in STI in Malaysia. ASM does this by providing independent, credible, relevant, and timely STI input of national and international importance to the country. Our network of expertise comprises Malaysian scientists, engineers, and technologists who specialize in various disciplines. The Academy assists in upgrading the nation's technological capabilities in the industrial sectors by producing high-quality publications such as peer-reviewed journals, monographs, and books. In addition, ASM also provides input on current and future technology trends to be considered and taken up by the government in driving the nation's economy forward. To provide Malaysian scientists with the best opportunities and exposure, ASM actively extends its international networks and collaborations. It currently has a range of multilateral engagements with renowned scientific institutions worldwide. The Academy also champions the need to grow the right talent in STI by cultivating interests in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics to the younger generation. In short, the Academy's ethos is proudly defined as Think Science, Celebrate Technology, Inspire Innovation. Science plays a vital role for economic development and societal well-being. Understanding this, the Academy of Sciences Malaysia was established with a mission to be Malaysia's thought leader in all areas of science, technology, and innovation. To realize its mission, ASM harnesses the nation's top scientific minds to chart the STI direction and facilitates the implementation of an innovation-led economy for the country. ASM's commitment lies firmly in fostering a culture of excellence in STI in Malaysia. ASM does this by providing independent, credible, relevant, and timely STI input of national and international importance to the country. Our network of expertise comprises Malaysian scientists, engineers, and technologists who specialize in various disciplines. The Academy assists in upgrading the nation's technological capabilities in the industrial sectors by producing high-quality publications such as peer-reviewed journals, monographs, and books. In addition, ASM also provides input on current and future technology trends to be considered and taken up by the government in driving the nation's economy forward. To provide Malaysian scientists with the best opportunities and exposure, ASM actively extends its international networks and collaborations. It currently has a range of multilateral engagements with renowned scientific institutions worldwide. The Academy also champions the need to grow the right talent in STI by cultivating interests in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics to the younger generation. In short, the Academy's ethos is proudly defined as Think Science, Celebrate Technology, Inspire Innovation.
Hello everyone, welcome to the session. This session is on climate smart agriculture in the tropics. Food, feed and fodder, fiber and fuel. These are the main agricultural products, although emerging technologies are also paving ways for high value and fine chemicals for various sectors to be produced by agricultural byproducts. With such enormous potential demand, how do we navigate the challenges from climate change? So I'm the moderator for this session. I'm Maha. I'm the Executive Director for the Malaysian Biotechnology Information Center, and I'm also the Global Coordinator for International Service for the Acquisition of Agri-Biotech Applications. In this session, the topic we are going to cover more with a focus on the tropics. So the tropic is where biodiversity hotspots, emerging economies, and large youth population are. It's also a geographical region that heavily rely on technologies from the north. How do we address food security and the scarcity of natural resources brought by climate change in the tropics while ensuring planet health is not neglected? So in this session, we have experts from different sectors: livestock, crop biotechnology, phycology, and a food futurist. I'm going to call upon the first speaker. I'm going to make the introduction very brief, but be assured that all our speakers are really prominent in their fields and their bio is in the website, the conference website. So please refer to that. So first speaker is Professor Emeritus Lindsay Felvey, who is an Australian Commissioner for International Agricultural Research and was previously board chair of the International Livestock Research Institute, Dean at University of Melbourne, and a director of Qatari investment in Australian agriculture. He has working experience in the corporate world, academic and government sectors, and is the fellow of the Academy of Technological Sciences and a life member of Clare Hall, University of Cambridge. So I invite Professor Pelvi to present his talk.
Thank you very much, Dr. Maha, and thank you to the organisers. It's an honour to speak at the Academy World Conference and to honour Professor Mahathir in the award. I'll talk briefly about the impact of climate change on livestock in the tropics, and also the inverse of that, the impact of livestock on climate change. Next slide, please. In order to highlight this, let me mention a few points. First of all, livestock is critically important and is grossly misunderstood, particularly as it refers to the tropics. The issues in less developed countries are quite different to those in more developed countries. In the fact that these are different issues, we have to be aware of what we are proposing if we are only thinking in the terms of our own lives or our own immediate environment, because the tropics is heavily weighted towards the less developed countries. This can create an ethical dilemma between climate action and the well-being of people, poor people, marginalised people in less developed parts of the world. I'll also mention something about ruminants and methane, since that is the common subject that livestock seem to elicit in climate discussions. Next slide, please. Let me emphasise the importance of livestock through just 4 general points. It's commonly assumed that livestock are a minor part of agriculture in the tropics. This is not true. On a global basis, 40% of agricultural GDP is livestock. Not only livestock by themselves, they are totally integrated with crop production and agriculture in general. A second point, and to me the most important point, is that nearly 1 billion people rely on animal-sourced food products to have proper lives. This means proper mental and physical well-being. Choline, for example, accessed through animal foods rather than through plant foods. Vitamins A and B12 more readily available, as are iron and zinc. It's all very well for us in well-fed situations to think that these nutrients can be accessed elsewhere. People in marginalised situations do not have that luxury. Physical development stunting is obvious. It leads to a lot of health difficulties. Mental underdevelopment means other development activities, economic activities, don't work. Education is not fulfilled because people cannot learn as readily as expected. The third point is that meat and milk, those 2 foodstuffs represent 5, meat and milk make up 5 of the 6 most valuable foodstuffs in the world. One final point, 25 to 40% of nitrogen on farms is coming from livestock. This is the small livestock producers that make up the majority of farmers in the world, and they are mainly in the tropics and mainly in the poorer countries. Nitrogen, of course, is essential for crop production, and it comes from fossil fuel. If we had 25 to 40% not coming from animals, we'd need that much more nitrogen produced from fossil fuels for fertiliser to produce the crops we eat. Otherwise, about 2 billion of us will not be able to survive. Next slide, please. These important livestock are looked after by 750 million or so smallholder livestock producers. If we look from this point into the future, then the International Livestock Research Institute proposes that about 1/3 might find alternative livelihoods, about 1/3 might succeed at market-oriented livestock livelihoods, and about 1/3 remain in that smallholder production that is largely subsistence. This sets a wide context for what we do in the tropics so that we do not disadvantage people. Food and nutritional security remain paramount, as Dr. Maha has introduced. At the International Livestock Research Institute, smallholders are talked about as smart holders. And the objective is to have thriving enterprises that are part of a vibrant, productive and resilient food system with less climate and other environmental impacts. Next slide, please. So the impacts on livestock, they are the obvious ones. Heat and nutrition stress decreases livestock production. Increased climate variability and the extremes that come with it lead to pasture productivity changing markedly. It leads to disease vectors, diseases of animals as well as of humans, changing. This means production systems change. This is all happening. This is happening through adaptive research, adaptation research. And this is not a new thing. This is not related to a current climate crisis as is publicly maintained today. This is the nature of livestock research and agricultural research through the past decades and will continue that way. Adaptation is simply maintaining or improving productivity to sustain the resource base. And in the case of animals, also minimising zoonotic diseases. Zoonotic diseases, of course, being those that pass from animals to humans, of which we have many examples, of course. Next slide, please. The domains for change: nutrition, genetics, and health. Another speaker is more learned than I on molecular genetics in plants. Molecular genetics and other genetics in animal breeding will be critical for animals more suited to changing environments, while also trying to conserve genetic resources in livestock. This is not as easy as simply putting plant seeds in an icebound environment in Svalbard. This takes a lot more resources. And animal genetics may also be able to address methane production from ruminants. Animal health, the livestock diseases that will change. We have to have sentinel herds monitoring in order to do that. One of the ways it's addressed in policy terms is through climate risk maps related to livestock, which is a product of the International Livestock Research Institute and readily available online. Next slide, please. So I've mentioned about the scientific work linking to the policy work in that climate map. In terms of livestock, methane emissions can be reduced by livestock research that increase production efficiencies. This doesn't mean feeding animals with Asparagopsis, the seaweed, which is much talked about. This can happen in certain controlled environments, usually in our own countries. But when we talk of these smaller holders in less fortunate situations, the best way to address this is to increase the production per animal so that you have more animal product from less animals. Having less animals is the key. Similarly, for an environmental benefit, less animals for more product. Animal to human disease transfers are also reduced by research, by looking at where these are occurring in hotspots around the world. Many of the hotspots, of course, coming out of Asia. This research is expensive, yet a recent analysis on a global basis, particularly focused on the research in these poorer areas of the world, shows a return of 10 to 1, higher than 10 to 1. Now, this is a fantastic rate of return when you consider that much of the research may have gone nowhere and other research has been spectacular. 10 to 1 across all research is something that should be known more widely. Next slide, please. The way that we can perpetuate this is through international and regional collaboration. I've mentioned ILRI. IFPRI is the International Food Policy Research Institute. This is how international collaboration in animal and plant and general agricultural and environmental research can be coordinated from all of our countries. And then on a regional basis, I am sitting in Australia. The Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research works through partnerships with $100 million a year for the Indo-Pacific region. Must involve researchers in those other countries through the Indo-Pacific region. Next slide, please. A number of changes will occur over the coming years. Increased productivity, smaller herd sizes, But then the people in wealthy countries such as us may require more meat, which would put paid to all of that. We may see smaller farmers in value chains to a greater extent. New disease challenges will face us. Biosecurity will need to be higher for pigs and poultry. And for contextualising all of this research is climate and environmental changes. It is not business as usual. It is merely a change and an increased need for livestock research inputs. Next slide, please. Collaboration between global and regional research is the imperative. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Pelvey. Very nicely put. I'm so impressed with the return of investment and the potential of livestock, yet all the challenges remaining. But again, you also outlined all the potential innovation that can intervene and bring in the benefits. Now, we're going to leave the questions for later. I'm going to call upon the next speaker, who is another prominent researcher, very accomplished. I would like to invite Professor Rob Martinson, Program Chair in Genomics and Plant Biology at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, New York. His research on epigenetic mechanisms of inheritance was named Breakthrough of the Year by Science in 2002. Dr. Martinson was made a Fellow of the Royal Society in 2006 and was awarded the Darwin Medal in 2020. He co-founded Orion Genomics and its Malaysian subsidiary Orion Bioscience Sdn Bhd, working with MPOB to deploy DNA test for genetics, or SHEL. We're going to hear more about that and epigenetic karma, traits that dramatically improve oil palm yield and sustainability. A very timely, a very urgent topic for Malaysia. Professor Martinson, the screen is yours.
So much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, good. Go ahead.
Excellent. It's really an honor to present at this conference. I think it's a really important and timely topic, not just for the tropics, but for the world as a whole and for agriculture. I'm going to tell you about genetic tools for sustainable oil palm. Thank you for that lovely introduction. We've been working on this for a while now, along with the Malaysian Palm Oil Board. On the next slide. Can you change the slide? Thank you. This is a very brief history of oil palm. Palm oil has been an important source of vegetable oil for thousands of years, dating back to West Africa and even ancient Egypt. It was introduced into Indonesia and Malaysia in the mid-1800s and now accounts for the world's most prominent source of edible oil, edible vegetable oil. Also, because of various chemical properties, it's actually an excellent source of biofuel as well. On the next slide. Breeding of oil palm has been going on for more than 100 years now. And it was breeders in Africa who first identified a series of traits that behaved like single genes. These include fruit color, purple and green fruit. This is a very useful marker to enable ripe fruit to be readily identified. But probably the most important single gene for oil palm yield is the thickness, controls the thickness of the shell. The shell, illustrated here in red, is a lignified seed coat that separates the fruit, which is where fruit oil or mesocarp oil is found, from the kernel, which contains kernel oil. And having a thin shell is one of the most productive forms of oil palm. Another variant that I'll be talking about is the mantled variant, which, as was just mentioned, actually has a strong epigenetic basis in oil palm as well. On the next slide, the shell gene controls oil yield in hybrids. So thick-shelled Dura palms have a very thick shell, and they don't, and although they have oil, they don't have as much as they could. The very shellless or thinnest shell Passifera palms are often female sterile, but they don't have a shell at all. But by making a hybrid between the two, the Tenera palm has more than 30% increase in yield compared with Dura. And so seed companies and nurseries provide Tenera palms to smallholders and to plantations to have the maximum possible yield. On the next slide. On the other side of the coin, mantled fruit is actually a floral abnormality that dramatically reduces yield. It occurs very rarely in seed palms, even in wild palms in Africa, but it occurs at a variable and sometimes high frequency in clonal planting materials generated by micropropagation. And this is sometimes a serious problem in certain types of plantation. On the next slide. The Malaysian Palm Oil Board has collected, through the efforts of Dr. Raja Naidu, more than 100,000 accessions from all over Africa and actually from South America as well, which are collected according to the Biodiversity Agreement. And this collection has been a fantastic genetic resource, both for breeders and for identifying these key genes. Just shown here, for example, are several accessions that have the fruit color trait. On the next slide. The Malaysian Palm Oil Board started the Oil Palm Genome Project, thanks to Ravi Sambanthamurthy and her colleagues back in the mid-2000s. And this has been a collaborative effort with Orion Genomics, but also with many other institutions around the world, such as the American Museum of Natural History. We were able to sequence the entire genome. It's almost 2 billion base pairs. It has about more than 30,000 genes in the genome. And this has allowed us to map these key important traits onto the genome. On the next slide. This is the genome team, comprising a team at the Malaysian Palm Oil Board, at the ABBC in Kuala Lumpur, and Orion Genomics based in the United States in St. Louis. On the next slide. The impact of the oil palm genome can be illustrated by publications. So we published the genome next click back in 2013, and we were able to identify all those traits, the single genes encoding the shell thickness, for example, and also fruit color, and finally the mantle abnormality, which is actually caused by a transposon called karma. And each of these discoveries was published in the journal Nature, one of the top journals in the world. On the next slide. We can map these genes onto the oil palm genome, shown here. So here are those 3 genes controlling shell thickness, fruit color, and the mantle abnormality. And because we now know the exact DNA sequence, we can use PCR tests. I think we're all familiar now with what a PCR test is, thanks to the ongoing pandemic. We can apply PCR tests to detect the different forms of the shell gene, for example, in different planting materials. And I'm going to tell you, I'm just going to summarize it here, but I'm going to tell you about some testing that we've done that predicts that we could increase, and this is just in terms of value of the crop, we could increase annual oil yield by $1 billion a year simply by introducing this test in a comprehensive, ultra-high throughput way. But we can think of that in different ways, not just in terms of GDP, but also in terms of sustainability. On the next slide. Orion Bioscience is a DNA testing company founded in Kuala Lumpur. And if you just go through the next few clicks, it uses go forward again. Yep. It uses a series of ultra-high throughput instrumentation to allow testing of the shell gene from either seeds or nursery seedling planting materials to determine whether it has the optimal Tenera conformation. You click one more time. Thank you. And this DNA analysis then can be applied at very high throughput to millions and millions of samples per year, allowing the genotypes, that's to say the shell gene, to be detected in each of these individual palms. And on the next slide, Orion Bioscience has been greatly supported by the MPOB leadership. I'm just showing here, I think one of the speakers in the previous session was Dr. Parviz, who's the current Director General of the MPOB, and they've been greatly supporting the research done here. We also have a DNA extraction lab in Borneo to make sure that we only ship DNA from one part of Malaysia to another and not the actual samples. On the next slide. On the next slide. The impact then of the shell test can be seen in terms of productivity, but also seen in terms of land use efficiency, which of course is the topic of this conference. and an incredibly important parameter in doing climate smart agriculture, shown here by a picture taken by my colleague Melina Abdullah from the MPOB, showing the rainforest on the left in Sabah and an oil palm plantation on the right. On the next slide, Orion Bioscience was given samples, took samples from over 1.1 million seedlings from smallholders, from nurseries, and actually also not shown here from plantation estates as well. And by estimating the frequency of the correct Tenera shell genotype in each of the samples, we could then estimate how much land use efficiency would be gained by testing and making sure that each of those smallholders only planted the correct Tenera material. And you can see that some of these efficiency gains in individual smallholders are absolutely enormous. The average gain is more than 12% overall, including the plantation estates. And we estimate then that by simply reducing land use to achieve the same productivity that's currently available, we could save something like 500,000 hectares of planted oil palm. On the next slide. This is a paper that was published recently, not by us, by a group in Nebraska, doing an analysis of land use efficiency and theoretical gains in oil palm productivity. And again, Dr. Parviz talked about this a lot in the last session. There's a theoretical yield potential of oil palm that is only very rarely reached. And in this publication, it was estimated, as you can see here, that many places throughout Indonesia actually had a long way to go in order to increase land use efficiency. But this also means there's a huge potential for improving land use efficiency in the future. On the next slide, I've superimposed the actual land use efficiency that could be gained right now by DNA testing of the planting materials supplied, in this case, to smallholders. As I said, that's also true of nurseries and plantations as well. This is something that could be applied very soon. It would, of course, take some time for the planting materials to be planted in replanting programs, but as a single, as just one strategy for improving land use efficiency, it would almost achieve half of all those gains that are predicted in this paper. So I'd just like to end on the last slide, just to say thank you to the MPOB, the Malaysian Palm Oil Board, that has sponsored the Genome Project from the outset. These are the chief management over all those years. And we're looking forward to applying these and the other tests as well, the Karma test for mantled and the fruit color test in the future to improve land use efficiency and hopefully many other aspects of sustainability for the oil palm. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Martinson. Very impressive. The two impressive things was, of course, a lot of things, but then two was, which caught my attention was the predicted 1 billion, I think it's dollars, impact on Malaysian GDP and how it is a land-saving technology. And also there is a Malaysian company doing this. That's really fascinating and impressive. So we will discuss this more later. Now, the next speaker is Dr. Anisha Hurtado. She was a senior scientist at the Aquaculture Department, Southeast Asian Fisheries Development Center, Philippines, for more than 20 years, where she spearheaded the seaweed program during her entire career at the center. She has served as a consultant in many international and national organizations and private sector. Just to name a few, World Bank, Asian Development Bank, USAID, Australian Aid, German Technological Development Agency, and Cargill. So with that, I would like to call upon Dr. Hurtado to talk about seaweed being a source of food.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Maha, for that very kind introduction. And good evening to all. Thank you very much for the invite to join this MSA webinar on tropical agriculture. It is such an honor to join our colleagues around the world. My talk tonight will focus on the impact of climate change on eukymatoids aquaculture in the tropics. Next, please. Southeast Asia as a tropical region is a physical, geographically, and economically rich in natural resources and biodiversity, both plants and animals. The Coral Triangle lies within the Southeast Asian region, which constitutes the following countries, namely Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Papua New Guinea, Timor-Leste, and Solomon Islands. Southeast Asia is the biggest seaweed producing region in the tropics, especially for the eukymatoids. Next, please. Globally, the Southeast Asian region, notably Indonesia, the Philippines, and Malaysia, are the major eukymatoid producing countries, while Cambodia, Vietnam, and Timor-Leste produce to a lesser extent. This is according to the latest FAO statistics. Next, please. There are four major genera found in the region. These are Capophycus, Euchima, Gracilaria, and Caulerpa. All of these are very edible. In fact, we are eating them as salads, as a sea vegetable salad, or even as pickles, or even placed in or mixed with vegetables as a viand. Next, please. Capophycus alvarezii, Case striatus, and Euchima denticulatum are generally called eukymatoids, as I have been saying a while ago. And there are different color morphotypes of each species, which are commercially farmed. Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines share the same different color morphotypes. And it's very interesting that we have a lot of color morphotypes that we can select in terms of euchima farming or eukymatoids farming. Next slide, please. Climate change is felt globally, not only terrestrially, but also in several bodies of water. As far as impacts of climate change on eukymatoids farming, there are three major impacts. One, ocean acidification brought by a decreased pH with a concomitant rise in temperature, which leads to, number two, adverse effects on production, causing pest and pathogens outbreaks, decreased biomass production, and unavailability of seedlings for the next cropping cycles. And consequently, number three, social imbalance among seaweed farmers due to frequent stronger typhoons, devastating farm structures leading to economic losses, especially in the Philippines. For all we know, the Philippines lies on the east along the Pacific Ocean, where almost 26 typhoons visit our country. So you can just imagine we are still on the wet season of the country, so we are still having some typhoons. Next slide, please. Adaptation and mitigation work hand in hand in delivering solutions to climate change. Adaptation, which involves modifying our decisions, activities, and ways of thinking to adjust to a changing climate in terms of aquaculture practices, farming different species to respond to the changing growing seasons and temperatures, or cultivating a variety of strains to reduce damage from pests and pathogens, while mitigation aims to reduce the cause of climate change, like first, selective breeding from wild populations, which are also to be discussed later on. And then second, selection of best traits in terms of growth performance, resilience to pests and pathogens infestations, and high-yielding hydrocolloid are to be adopted. And third, control of disease and endophytes. All these phyconomic intervention strategies have direct parallels to land-based agronomic practices, that is, use of seed treatments, breeding and selecting productive cultivars, production of hybrid plants, applications of phycobiostimulant, and plant protection agents. Next slide, please. In selective breeding, Capophycus, which come from wild populations, must be preserved and conserved for their germplasm for possible sources of new plants, cultivars, through spores or tissue culture techniques. Eukymatoid farming was pioneered in the Philippines, and it's now more than 50 years, and we have been using the same cultivar since day one. And we can just imagine how there is a decrease in the genetics of this Kappa ficus. In fact, before it was only 2 meters, and now it's only a foot in terms of length. So you can just see the deterioration. Next slide, please. Likewise, strains of K. alvarezi, which have proven to be fast-growing ones and high carrageenan yields, must be selected and grown in deeper waters using eco-friendly planting materials to avoid adverse effect of rising temperature. We have been using traditional practices since the beginning, but because of climate changes, we are not changing or shifting our practices into more eco-friendly. Next slide, please. And the use of phycobiostimulant from brown seaweed extracts have shown to improve tolerance of eukymatoids to abiotic stresses like high salinity, high temperature, and even high light intensity. And there have been a lot of reports pertaining to this phycobiostimulant. In one of my experiments, it says that when you apply or dip the seaweed from a brown seaweed extract, even though it is being enveloped with seaweeds, when you remove that, it's still very, very robust and healthy. Next slide, please. Tackling the adverse effects of climate change, be it aquatic or terrestrial, needs collaboration from the national, regional, to international agencies. One cannot do it alone. The academia, the private sector, the industry, and most importantly, the government and the public must work harmoniously with one another to adopt modifications and mitigate the adverse effects for us to have a happier and healthier world to live in. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. This is one of the places in the Philippines wherein it's in the southern Philippines, wherein extensive farming of seaweeds is done, and we are just next to Sabah of Malaysia. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Hurtado. That's really beautiful. And I just wanted to say, I actually tasted Corlepa racemosa. I think it's called sea grapes.
Grapes,
and it's
or
very
latok.
yes,
Latok
yes,
in
that's
Bahasa.
yes. It was very crunchy. We'll talk more about that again. Let me now introduce our final speaker, who is going to bring all these things together because he is a futuristic, a food futuristic. Mr. Luke Tay, he's an independent food futuristic and not short of experience in this field. Luke holds a Bachelor of Arts in History and International Relations and an MA in Master of Arts in Political Science from the University of Pennsylvania. He served for close to 2 decades in various foresight, strategy, people development, and internationally oriented roles in Singapore's public service. So I think he has got a very exciting presentation here. I invite Mr. Tay.
Dr. Maha, it's indeed my pleasure to be addressing you. And I guess I'm a generalist in a chat room full of specialists. So I make it my business to learn more and more about more and more. And I won't caricature what specialists do as learning more and more about less and less. But I think my journey as a futurist has been to see how really it takes a village of different expertise to help to conceive, design, and implement more positive futures for an ecosystem such as the food system. And clearly, this is an existential one, so of great interest to all of us. Next slide, please. Next, please. Yep. Okay, so I'll skip this scope and really jump right in. I'll be talking to you about a little bit about the context of the current food system, a scenario to frame our thinking, and then sharing some provocations about areas in which maybe we can string some of the themes that we've discussed together for future endeavors. So I think just a quick word on foresight, futurism, strategic thinking, whatever you call it. It's really just interdisciplinary approach and framework to help think about how the future could be different beyond the weight of the past, to inform decision makers, help them think beyond their blind spots, and improve the future proofing of plans and strategies, for instance, for food security in the future, be it for a city, a country, or a region, or the world. And I think importantly is also to rally all stakeholders around a common vision that can be co-created. Next, please. Okay, so some key driving forces, trends, and uncertainties moving forward. Obviously, climate change. I would suggest that climate smart agriculture is a key pillar of, I guess, how the whole food system, including the consumers and also those things that are eaten, and the whole process, manufacturing, and so on, needs to become more climate congruent as an existential factor, and also for greater quality of life and satisfaction. The people factor, geopolitics, my pet topic as a political scientist, historian, and also the role of technology. So let me bring you through a quick tour of the horizon and then jump into scenarios. Next. Next, please. Okay, so on climate change, I think clearly it's very significant, becoming more acute, yet there are still uncertainties on just to what extent it will impact the food system. And it's a variable, there are many variables, including how well we can adapt and mitigate. And also, I think from a policy lens, will policymakers impose certain measures in an attempt perhaps to catch up and make the food system become more climate positive. Next. Okay, in terms of social demographic change and population, I think the first thing to really problematize about the litany we talk about, I think the UN talks about 2050, 9 plus 10 billion population, is, will there really be? I think there's been COVID birth slump with the long COVID, who knows? So that's one very key part of the equation. How many mouths will there be to feed? What will succeeding generations' food values, practices, and habits be? How activist will they be in demanding and enacting change in the food system, for example? So imponderables there. And what will they expect of their governments and of the food industry? Next. Okay, so I think the food sector employs, agri-food employs more than 60% of the world's population still. So it's a very big deal. I think some other speakers have made the point of how, we can't just look at, reducing emissions in isolation, but we have to look at the longer tail of the question to problematize it. Next. Next, please. Okay, so I think in terms of geopolitics, to put it simply, are we going into a new Cold War, for example, based on what's happening, AUKUS and so on? And if the politics skews that way, how will the food system be shaped from beyond? I think we're very good at looking at food, at the science of food, but there's also obviously the politics of food. And it begs the question, including with COVID, may states try to take more control of their own food destiny through trying to seize more food sovereignty, increasing local production self-sufficiency. Next. Okay, so I'll just cycle quickly through these slides related to politics. I think there's a lot of food fake news, and I think the battle of information vis-a-vis misinformation will be a central theme of the future of food, including for whether there's social license for the various new foods that have been coming up. Next. And of course, if there are certain events, we may even need to think about how to restart the global food system from scratch. Next. And there's speculation over, whether mushrooms may be the way there. But I think what I've picked up in recent times is there are more serious-minded people just thinking of how the food system needs to be reset. Should there be a catastrophic global catastrophic risk event that actually occurs. Next. Okay, so wealthy people are thinking about how to survive, and of course, the food is one aspect. I suggest to you that this will be actually a very good business venture to go into. Next. But for carrying the whole of society, there are organizations that, like Allfed, that are also thinking about what are the disaster scenarios and what needs to be done. Next. Okay, so lastly on technology, I'm not a technologist, but suffice to say that it's not the technology per se, but how it's put together, the business model innovation, whether it's economically viable, and also, again, the politics may come into it in terms of how technology extension in such sensitive areas like bioengineering, which is one key factor for the future of food, may or may not be regulated and complicated. Next. Okay, so I think putting things together, there's also a lot of politics and battle of narratives around how we move forward. Is it the Great Reset? Is it building back better? Is it Extinction Rebellion? Next. And of course, there's a food aspect to it. And so I think one way to frame the discussion is, are we going for degrowth? Or next, is there a way out through technological sophistry and breakthroughs so that we can enjoy far more while having a far smaller eco footprint? And is that tenable? And are we banking things in that have yet to be realized or may never be realized? Next. Okay, so let me just go on to scenarios on the next slide. Okay, so I put it to you that the global food system has become more global, import-export wise, food deficit, food surplus countries, especially with the Cold War. Next, with the end of the Cold War. So our food system, I think I'll just speak since I'm mindful of the time running down. So our food system is highly globalized right now. COVID, of course, was the jolt to question how tenable that is. And we've also had a lot of aftershocks in terms of various supply chain disruptions to human beings in the supply chain, to logistics, and so on. So if you just skip down 5 slides, let me go to some scenarios that crystallize all this together. In short, I've been thinking about how the future of food really, firstly, gets problematized by the building blocks. Traditionally, we think of agrarian areas and imports as a source of food. But now, food is being produced more in homes, in neighborhood collectives, in cities like Singapore and other places are trying to, urban, peri-urban. And there are more food packs coming up on a international, but not fully international level among friends, among regions as treaty. Okay, we move down 3 more slides. Okay, so these are the scenarios that I developed. Firstly, thinking about how much more viable than today producing food close to demand will be. And secondly, how imperative would it be to do so based on the global situation in terms of the ravages of climate change, in terms of geopolitics, and so on. And I came up with these 4 scenarios that I'll be happy to talk about more in the discussion rather than hijacking the time with my presentation. Okay, so now I'll just conclude with a few more thoughts on some areas that may be of high potential for the future of food, building on this. One would be smart food cities. Can cities become obviously far more circular, leveraging on technologies to produce in an eco-sustainable way, including in terms of the energy and water flanks, far more of their own nutritional needs. What are some building blocks? One of them I suggest is personalized nutrition, but aggregated to population levels, both for self-actualization and superior nutrition, health, wellness, and vocational benefits for individuals, but also in the aggregate to become more climate smart, more sustainable, less consumptive. 2 and 3 together. Can we look at the future of agroforestry and the future of mariculture and overlay on that all the breakthrough technologies such as synthetic bioengineering, and other techniques that can really lead to abundance, that I think will be another challenge to imagine. For example, where in the tropical forests, the first peoples, can they coexist with a suite of technologies to provide ecosystem services, including a lot of highly nutritious and medicinal foods to others while preserving and restoring their environment? Can we hold desertification and other ravages of climate change at bay through various forms of terraforming and, dare I say, even geoengineering, although that's highly problematic. So thank you for your attention, and I can expand on these themes in the discussion.
Thank you, Luke, for that very futuristic, truly futuristic presentation. So much to digest. But one thing I'm glad is you did not speak about terraforming the Mars. I'm not sure if everyone is on the same page as me, but I'm not for it. But that is for another day's discussion. So all the other speakers also presented a lot of very rich content. Now let's decipher that further. Now I'm going to go to my questions before we open the questions to the floor. I want each speaker, each expert to talk about what are the enablers that support climate smart research or commercialization, innovation in your area of work, and how this can be specifically adapted for the tropics. For example, collaboration. I am very passionate about political will because I think this is what is really lacking. Funding, regulations, expertise, policies, or anything. So what are the enablers? Let's go from the start in the same order. Professor Felvi, if you can go first.
Thank you, Dr. Maha. Well, what are the enablers? All of the things that you have elicited, I think, are important and more. Let me start with collaboration. I mentioned it in what I said. I think that the existing international research organizations are a means of harnessing the research that goes on across all countries and apply that to the area I was talking about, which is specifically the poorer parts of the tropics. In terms of political will, this is increasingly a problem. I think that if we talk of it as an enabler, that's under the best conditions. Under current conditions, we're seeing a bit of a retraction of that political will as countries focus on their own national problems. In the case of COVID, this is understandable, but it was occurring before the pandemic. Some of it out of Europe, where there was a focus on migration, immigration, causing problems and diverting what used to be significant contributions for international research to their own purposes. This relates to funding. In terms of regulations, I don't see that as a major constraint in what we're doing at the moment in the poorer areas. Other speakers can talk about the areas that affect urban situations, and I think Luke will have something to offer there. In terms of expertise, collaboration is critically important, and it's why I mentioned the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, which insists on working in a partnership mode between Indo-Pacific or Asian, whatever word we want to call, Asian scientists with Australian scientists on an equal footing and funding that activity. I think these are the types of enablers that are currently working and can be expanded. The one that is holding us back, in my opinion, is that related to political will, which affects the funding. Funding should also come from the countries concerned, but that is more difficult and is better comes in terms of reorienting current government departments and universities. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Falvi. Okay, looks like livestock in the area of, in your area, regulation is not a problem, but where genetic technologies, I see regulations still stifling a lot of work scientists would like to do. Now, I would like to ask the same question to Professor Martinson for your area of work.
I think that all of the points just made were fantastic. I can only agree more. In terms of basic research, it's important to realize that we only understand, for example, the genes we discovered in oil palm because of basic research done in other plants in universities around the world. And actually, for example, some of the most powerful technologies in genome selection were actually invented in livestock and have now been applied to plant breeding. So this sort of cross-fertilization is very common in academic circles, and it would be great to see it more widely applied, both in the commercial arena and especially in government. And I think while funding for basic research in some parts of the world has been quite good, it would be great to see research more done locally in Malaysia and Indonesia, for example, but also in Africa and South America and in my field of oil palm. I can only I couldn't agree more about the political will scenario, but I think it's worth thinking about what underlies the sort of politics of smart agriculture. I think it's very important that everyone gets to see the benefits from new technology, and in a sense, what political will reflects is the attempts to make sure that it's not just the big plantation companies, for example, the big estates that are benefiting, but the smallholders do too, and everybody in the supply chain that's responsible for putting together this extraordinary industry. And so when it comes to making political decisions about research or about standards, about certifications and so on, it's important that everybody benefits. And that's where governments can really play a role. In palm oil, for example, the governments benefit from tax revenues coming from sales of palm oil, for example. And in Malaysia, at least, they've been very, very good about sponsoring basic research, taking advantage of some of those revenues. And I think that's the direction forward if we're really going to exercise political will for everybody's benefit.
Thank you. And I think you brought in the aspect of basic research. And I think this is really important. And we could actually do better in basic research, which is which lays the fundamental, the building blocks for all those commercialization and translational research. Now, Dr. Furtado, what have you got to say?
Yeah, I totally agree with Dr. Fuvli and Dr. Martison about the 4 enablers. We need really collaboration. Now, in terms of seaweed farming in the tropics, we are just lucky that the developing countries like the Philippines and Malaysia are engaged now with a very big project on seaweeds funded by UKRI. And some time ago also, the ACR is also connected with Indonesia in terms of Indonesia, in terms of euchymatoid farming and others. So I can see the significance and importance of collaboration, not only national, regional, but also more importantly on the international level. For the political will, it's really hard to discuss this because it's highly politics. It's highly politics, and it depends purely on the direction of the president or even the government, because we change administration every six years also. So in terms of regulation, we are also lucky that under our Global Seaweed Star project under UKRI, we are now preparing our national policies in terms of seaweed farming, more specifically on biosecurity and farm management. And along that project, we have some basic researches and also applied sciences. And for the expertise, well, in the Philippines, we have state universities and research institution international at that can that can help in the furtherance of the seaweed farming of the Philippines. Malaysia is very strong in molecular basic research in terms of euchymatoids. In fact, I have a very good collaboration with the University of Kuala Lumpur of Malaysia. And it's really nice that all these enablers are really pointing out to some good ones, but the the least one is the political will. It's so hard to discuss about political will. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Furtado. Luke, I'm sure you have lots to say as well.
Me. Okay. So I think that certainly I think you need the STEM research base and specialization. I certainly don't mean to denigrate it, but I think my view would be that building on that, it would be to have cross-disciplinary teams and cross-stakeholder teams that are needed really to think about and tackle pretty much all the big human challenges, certainly in the food sphere. I mean, let me give you one example. Bioengineered foods, CRISPR and beyond, obviously you need bioengineers, you need but you also would need, among other things, maybe cultural anthropologists to think about how to develop and sell messages. You would need people skilled in productizing it. You need people from the regulatory sciences and so on to onboard it, and you would need people to design the systems that actually would roll out the different use cases, be it that protected forest that I mentioned that is still very fecund and also performing ecosystem and mitigation adaptation services, or in an urban use case. I think to an urban use case, I think a lot of times, revolutions, either new ideas or on the regime change front, occur in cities, because that's where the bread riots tend to start, and this is not ancient history. This is even from, just over a decade ago, from the Arab Spring and so on. And I think there'll be a lot more of that, So I think the last point I'll make at this stage will be that I think there needs to be a lot of responsiveness and iteration with policymakers. And futurists also have a role here in terms of trying to help people think through the second, even third order implications of different courses of action or inaction, including in terms of food security. So that's the challenge right now, because we are fighting a fire, especially on the food insecurity flank, but we are also trying to redesign and turn the ship for the longer term. So a lot of collaboration, cross-disciplinary action.
Yeah, one thing that you, very key thing that you brought up is cross-disciplinary team. I think what we always do is work among hard science, right? Natural sciences. Now we really need to work with social scientists, economists, agribusiness, and like what you said, even cultural and anthropologists. I'm going to come to that later. Social licensing. I'm going to come to that later. Now, my next question was challenges, but I think we covered that as well while talking about enablers. I want to take one question from the participant. Here, I've got a question from Vasuntra. She's asking, how can we preserve microenvironment? So we're talking about environment, but how about microenvironments through climate smart technologies? Is that a possibility, anyone? Or in your field, how do you do that?
Let me make a comment without providing an answer.
Yes, please.
I think a lot of our discussion about climate and the changes that we see predicted assumes that we have the power to keep things as they are. I don't think that is the case. I think things change. They always change. And the climate is changing faster now than perhaps it has through recent history. But there have been large periods of climate change in the past. And I think adaptation becomes the most critical response to this. And it's the hardest response because we've all developed an idea of sustainability being sustaining exactly the way we want to live. I think the way that we live will change. And the microbiome will also change in different situations, and new microbiomes will arise, as is already occurring every minute as we speak. So that's a general comment rather than an answer to the specific question.
Yeah, definitely we need more thinking along these lines, and more research, and also the adaptation, not only the environment, but we need to adapt. How are we going to live with COVID for the rest of our life? That's an adaptation from our side, right? Yeah. Okay. I'm going to ask this question, which is very close to my heart, about social licensing. We always talk about approvals from the authorities, regulated, approved. But then increasingly we see that some things can be approved, but it's not adopted because the people are not accepting it. So how do we work towards getting those social licensing? And Luke spoke about that. Dr. Furtado, in your field, for example, how do you change the behavior of people to eat seaweed, right, as an alternative or even as a staple nutrient, whether it's micronutrient or what? So how do we do that in all your field? And even Professor Martinson, the genetic tools, how do we get your stakeholders to use this?
Yeah, you spoke about how would you change the diet or something like how would you practice the children to eat as early age seaweeds. Uh, Asia has been known to be eating seaweeds for quite some time already, and especially in the coastal areas. I'm speaking for the Philippines. Mostly, all the Filipinos we eat seaweeds, especially during the summertime when seaweeds are very abundant in the coastal lines, in the coastal shores. We gather them from the wild populations, and you know what? Sometimes the upland people during summertime they go down, they gather, they dry it, and they utilize it as one of their ingredients in viands or even in their salad also during rainy season. So as early as possible, the children are already trained to eat seaweeds already. Unlike in Europe, they have just started. They have just started the changing the palate of the Westerners. But for us in the Southeast Asia region or in the Asia Pacific, Japan, China, Korea, our countries, Malaysia, we eat a lot of seaweeds. I didn't discuss more of these edible seaweeds because it will. I'm given only a 10-minute talk. So as young as they are, and knowing the nutrients, the micronutrients we get from seaweeds, then we have to train the children. So that is a very good question you pointed out, Dr. Maha. And it's nice that nowadays other countries are beginning to love to eat seaweeds, and not only as plain seaweeds, it's now a gourmet seaweed. They place it in their pasta, they place it in their pizza and others. So it's just training the young children as early age to eat seaweeds.
Thank you, Dr. Furtado. Dr. Professor Martinson, how about your field? What are the challenges that you face in getting acceptance of these new genetic tools that you want to commercialize and which has got huge impact in saving the planet?
I think there are several answers to that. I mean, one, just to stick on that topic just for a moment, you mentioned earlier that there are byproducts of oil palm that are actually very exciting from a nutritional point of view, things like phenolics and so on, which can enter markets that are quite new and different from the sort of traditional Asian markets, which is where most palm oil is consumed. And similarly, and maybe I shouldn't bring this up, but plant-based meats are also a big consumer of palm oil and coconut oil as well. And this has been another new market for those materials. In terms of social acceptance and social will, you know, sustainability is something that benefits everyone, and it's becoming clearer and clearer whether you're, you know, a resident of a smallholder plantation in Sumatra, you know, during the fires, or whether you're in industry and trying to maximize your profits. I mean, in all cases, sustainability is going to be the answer. And I think, I mean, I'm not an economist at all, and I know there have been wonderful sessions on agricultural and agronomic aspects of all of this, but putting a value on sustainability is something that I think has been under explored. For example, in something I'm more familiar with, in carbon markets, the value of carbon is in a way the sort of single metric by which you can measure the success of any climate change aversion scheme. And putting a value on sustainability might be another way to help with this social acceptance for example, oil palm and palm oil as such a key component of the food chain of human nutrition, and yet has to balance that with sustainable arguments and with biodiversity and climate change. And so I think economists, I mean, that's one of the reasons I've been enjoying this conference, can really contribute to helping us understand that riddle.
Luke or Professor Felvey, do you want to add on? But Professor Felvey, before you add on to social licensing, I want to also ask you, how do you see livestock industry, the landscape of livestock industry changing in the lights of plant-based and lab-based meat?
Well, thank you. Let me talk of that first of all. Then plant-based meats, if they are to be called meats, there seems to be some objection to that in the livestock industry. One of the considerations that I agree with from what has just been said is that if we look at the climate impacts of these different products, we have to look at where all the different products are sourced from and the industry that creates these products. I think they have a place because of the fashions in Western and wealthy people around the world. I don't see them as providing in their current form a substitute for the nutrients that I mentioned earlier. They don't contain those essential nutrients in microscopic quantities that are available in animal source products. They may in the future, or there may be other means. Then the problem would be getting it to those poor people in marginal situations that really have a need. So it's a matter of, the wealthy versus the others, as usual. In terms of social license, I think one of the things that can be linked to this was in Dr. Tay's talk about fake news. Social license, depending on the society, is a factor in Western countries and in democracies in particular. And with populist governments, fake news can actually influence how people think, vote, and what they will give license to and allow their governments to approve or not approve. This can affect anything from molecular biology through to things that we haven't discussed at this stage. That's fake news. But then fake news in that case can be just called a form of ignorance on the part of those people. And we have a large level of ignorance about the detailed science that is used. So the social license actually requires on good public education in a democratic country. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Falvey. When we talk about lab-based meat, that's cell cultured, tissue cultured in the lab, I always feel that we need to do a proper energy audit. We always say that it is less, it produces less environmental footprint, but then the energy used, the electricity used, we're still not sure, and I don't have an answer for that. I'm not sure if you do.
I have the same concerns that you do.
Okay.
No answer.
Thank you. Luke, do you want to say anything about social licensing, adoption, approval, public behavior?
Yep. Okay. I think on this, so basically what we're trying to do is to build a people-centered and eco-congruent future food system. So I think, yeah, so one of the central challenges will be this whole information, misinformation, persuasion thing. And so it's the persuasion sciences, that will have to get us there, behavioral psychology. Also, what type of policy cues and nudges. So it's interdisciplinary. And I think that on that, the COVID crisis is really starting us off, because think about it, vaccines, especially mRNA ones, are all about, trust the science, trust public health authorities. And I think the jury is still out, both objectively as well as in the battle of public perception and opinion on how this pans out. I've been double vaccinated myself. So I think that basically the learnings that the global court of public opinion take away from this yet to be ended crisis will be transferred even if it's unscientific, even if it's another branch, another product, to a lot of things like novel foods, for example. So these are the scenarios that I'm thinking about. One where it's more science on, and another where maybe skeptics and peddlers of misinformation, including those with a certain geopolitical agenda, may win out. And so that comes to the climate emergency that we were discussing earlier. I think we've been talking so far mostly about planning for success. Let's preserve normalcy, this global population, and let's think of that future. We've also got to plan for failure modes. And I think here is where again the social license will come in, but perhaps with a shared sense of urgency in terms of, for example, yes, persuading people to eat constrained or very changed palette of foods. Like there was the Eat Lancet diet that came out 2 years ago, and it was poo-pooed by lots of people, including lots of Asians, because it's rubbish. You're asking me to eat these things. It's not even with my culture, and all these people are going to get unemployed if you impose this diet on me. So we may need to go in certain directions, and then that speaks to the debate over, let's say, livestock, versus some of these novel foods, and may we need to pivot more towards new foods. That will also be a big challenge to manage.
Yeah, you said trust the science, but then I think it's easier, not easier. It is more effective with the public if they trust the people who's behind the science. So this is where the scientists have to really come out and be a public person, not just in your ivory towers, because the public do not have to know the science, but if they trust the people behind the science, they don't need to read a journal, they don't need to have all those data. This is based on my experience in science communication. So we just bought an airline without knowing who the pilot is, without knowing anything about aviation, but we bought a flight. So it's more about trusting the people, and scientists have to be the trusted source. I've got a question here from the audience to Professor Martinson. Now, I hope I'm going to reword it, or unless Prof. Martinson understands this. Now, the question from Firos is it possible to genetically influence byproduct that are carcinogen in the oil palm? I think what he's saying is the byproduct that's coming out from the refinery or from processing the oil palm, like acrylamide and glycol. Can they be genetically modified? I think that is the question.
I mean, certainly we can breed for lower levels of certain byproducts that make processing more expensive. For example, I mean, even if those byproducts are disposed of in processing, if we could breed to avoid them, it would be a significant advantage. I mean, I'm thinking, for example, in forestry, for example, lignin is a major toxic byproduct of pulp production, and so there are lots of efforts underway to try to reduce lignin by breeding in forestry crops. But in terms of genetic modification, I think genetic modification of many crop plants is still not really feasible for regulatory reasons around the world. That's a very important topic. In the United States, of course, genetic engineering has been around for a long time in agriculture, but we have to be very careful about other markets before we can really deploy tools like genome editing or gene editing, for example. I would say in defense or in support of the work that's been done here by MPOB is that you have to know what the genome sequence is before you can engineer it. And so that was very much step one, and I think it's very it's foresighted to get all that information first, and you can use it as we have in classical breeding to do as much as possible to improve quality, which would include removing any byproducts that otherwise are hard to process. Absolutely.
Yeah. Definitely, there are potential, but then we have to be also careful which technology we are going to deploy. Now, one question to all speakers or whoever wants to talk about this: are countries in the tropics on the way to be self-sufficient in terms of innovation, research, or are they still reliant on technologies from multinational corporations in your fields? Who's going on this?
Maybe I
Yeah.
could.
Okay.
Okay. Yes, Professor Martinson.
I mean, I think this goes back to what I was saying about basic research. That it's important that technologies are developed in the regions that are going to benefit from them, and certainly in oil palm breeding and in oil palm biotechnology, that is the future, and it has been very much so. That doesn't mean you can't collaborate and use technologies from outside, Malaysia in this case, but it's very important to have that local interaction and to build up the resources, human, most importantly, at the universities and at the companies in the region that's going to benefit from the technology.
Yes, Professor Hurtado.
Yeah, I agree totally with Dr. Mertison about the basic sciences or basic research that as as a member of the tropical region, we have to really develop our own research, which is really adaptable to our own environment, and also for the applied science also, because if we rely entirely from the MNCs or multinational corporations, it will be very, very difficult because sometimes they bring in their own technology, which is not adaptable or suited or appropriate to our environment or even to our own setup. So it's really necessary for us to develop our own technology and innovations for our own good. Well, we need also others, but into a lesser extent.
Yes, because then we know the priority, the challenges of our
Correct.
farmers, our consumers,
Yes.
our
Yes.
environment. Yes. Anyone else wants to jump in? Professor Felvi, do you have anything to say about this?
Yes, rather than talk of the multinationals, just talk about the public sector or the sector that's undertaking research oriented to the poorer people of the world in particular. And are the tropics or are Asian countries on the way to being self-sufficient? Of course they are on that way. Many are there already. But I don't see that national parochialism is going to be the answer to this. I think there has to be this international collaboration across barriers where we don't really care where we're from. We're just looking at what the problems are in a particular situation. Breaking down those barriers further, which was happening until relatively recently, I would see the way to have research undertaken where it is needed. I see some countries in Southeast Asia in particular, Malaysia is one of them, having graduated from various forms of past colonial activity or past colonial linkages, so that there is a self-sufficiency there. Building on that further means that we have more scientists in these countries, and they can then be working just across their own borders in a culture that is not too different and probably make a bigger impact than importing somebody from here, Australia or somewhere else. So I see self-sufficiency is developing, but we do need that collaboration of people from everywhere working on a true partnership basis.
Yeah, sure. And this is where all the CG institutes come into, play a very important role. Luke, do you want to say something? I've got, yeah, Luke, go
Okay,
ahead.
just to jump in quickly on this topic, I guess, of course, the tropics is not a place that others do things to only. We can also build up our own capabilities, our own MNCs. I would be a good Singaporean by saying that. So MNC would not just come from beyond these latitudes. I think that what may be quite relevant for Asia or for the tropics will be a few type of capabilities to build up, and those aren't exclusively about new scientific knowledge, but maybe about processes, refining processes and refining design. One Health, I think, will be a key one. I think without good One Health, there go your livestock, right? I mean, jokes aside, I think that that is probably the greatest risk that ILRI will need to manage in terms of and then if not, then we have to go with the plant-based alternatives and rely. And it comes to a second one on my list on what like biofortification, reformulation, type of food sciences, to especially if we are in a climate constrained palette of foods in the future. How do you keep up the nutrition level? I think there's a lot of gut microbiome research going on that I guess can be localized to the ethnicities and the dietary preferences of people in this area. And if we really push it to extremes, and again, in a climate constrained dystopia of the future, it might even be to have interventions that are not so expensive, that people take to make sure that their nutrient absorption is very good if they have to survive on very little. So that might be a frugal solution. I think the last one to lob this way, especially for maritime Southeast Asia like Philippines, Singapore, small island states, is you get smaller with climate change and sea level rise. So the adaptation response is to learn to live on the sea and to subsist on stuff that comes from the sea, under the sea, on the sea. So I think that's where mariculture, be it seaweed or cages at sea,
permaculture,
and so on. So that again, there's many solutions out there. Like University of Durham, some folks there have developed salt tolerant rice that can be grown at sea. I think they're trying to trial that out, for example. So solutions around the blue economy.
Luke, before I let you go, there's a question specific, maybe you could answer this. With the climate change that's happening, do you think in the future we have to grow plants inside a greenhouse? I mean, it's already happening, but do you think it's going to be like vastly adopted that most plants are grown in, except for oil palm, of course?
I see. So I think that comes back to the point on what is the true ESG footprint. So that itself is a science to build up, to have the full environmental cost accounting.
Yeah.
I think that may be one of the paths, but it's not the only one. I think there's on the spectrum, there's full indoor farms that of course currently consume a lot of electricity because it's artificial lighting. Then I guess greenhouses are one notch better as long as you have sun, for obvious reasons. I think that this speaks to one of the earlier questions also, which is about can you control the climate on a zonal basis? If on a whole theater global basis it's going down. I think to me that would be an important question. I think some of the solutions are out there, people exploring developing it. But yes, let's say if you're trying to protect your precious food bowl from the encroachment of the ravages of heating and desertification, then that will be one thing to look at. And there's also the maritime equivalent. Can you have a coastal farm for seaweed or something else that also in a very cheap and viral way can build up a natural bun against seawater incursion?
Okay. We have 5 more minutes coming to the end of the session. Dr. Hurtado, very specific question to you from the audience, Tamil Chilvan, and please answer this briefly. What will be your advice or suggestion on growing seaweed on recycled sea water that was used for fish farming? Is it a sustainable idea?
Yes, actually we call it the integrated. Yeah, because the effluents are already still rich in NP, nitrogen, and phosphorus, and it still be used for seaweed farming. Yeah.
Okay, so
in fact, that's the land base. But in the sea base, we have also the integrated multi-trophic aquaculture, wherein you have the fish cage, then you have the mollusks or the shellfishes, and then finally you have the seaweeds.
Yeah.
So you have the land base and the sea base.
Okay.
It's possible.
Highly possible. Highly possible, sustainable, and that is what is probably the future, the integration of all these things. So thank you so much to all our prominent speakers and for the active participation from our audience. We have come to the end of our session, and we heard from the experts in major food sectors, crops, livestock, food from marine sources, and we also had a food futurist who spoke about various non-science issues that play a role in influencing decisions in food production. Agriculture is a huge sector. We still have poultry, future food, fragrance and flavors, and aquaculture, and many more. And climate change affects all these sectors, and there is an urgent need to adapt and mitigate the issue. Food production itself is multidisciplinary, involves multi-stakeholder. We spoke about that. We spoke about collaboration. We spoke about working with existing research institutes and having inclusivity, how we have to involve the whole country, not leaving anyone behind. Luke spoke very briefly about One Health. Now, these are all important. How we bring in innovation, new capabilities, new scientific knowledge so that the countries in the tropics can be self-sufficient. But of course, having said that, we also still need to collaborate. There's nothing wrong in collaboration, and collaboration is probably, one key enablers that we need to strengthen. And we also spoke about social licensing, because food is a contagious issue. The society, what is that the society wants and accepts? Now, increasingly, we are living in post-truth, post-trust era, where romanticizing food production is a trend. People want food produced in cottage industry, handpicked, organic, small-scale agriculture, and we know this is not going to work, especially for tropics where the demand is growing. People are becoming more affluent. The protein demand is also going to grow. We need to create job opportunities. So we need to intensify agriculture. But at the same time, we must also make sure that it does not contribute further to climate change. So how can we do all these things? And there are also studies that, that shows environmental footprint is created more in developing countries by small-scale family farms compared to in US, intensified farmers, but there's a lot of precision agriculture going on there. So how do we again strike the balance and also put all these myths to rest? A lot of myth about food production, about agriculture. And again, Professor Martinson spoke about genetic tools testing. This is the way to go, and very impressive how these genetic tools can actually create an impact in not just tropic, but also in the world. And probably it's still underutilized. How can we adopt more, develop more? So with that, I would like to end the session by saying the need for emphasizing the need for collaboration, enabling regulations and policies. And it's not just about policies. Many countries have good policies. How do we effectively implement these policies? Political will. Everyone spoke about that, although it is, of course, a tall order and not easy to tackle. We also need cross-cutting studies in socioeconomics, ethics, social licensing policies, and social sciences cannot be neglected. Luke spoke very well about that. So with that, thank you so much in joining us in this session. Have a good day. For those who are already late into the night, have good rest. Thank you so much. Thank you again to all the speakers.
Thank you too.
Thank you very much to all the panelists for their insight and inputs. We have come to the end of the second day of the conference. We hope everyone has gained new knowledge and insights, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thank you and have a good day.